Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. In this episode, I will be speaking with Professor Kwasi Konadu from Colgate University, where he is the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Endowed Chair, and the topic will be names of enslaved Africans and the importance and the relevance of these names. So thank you so much, Kwasi, for coming on to the podcast today and spending your time to talk about African names and how that was during the time of enslavement.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So we'll start with the first question, knowing that names are such an important, and it connects to identity, whether culturally or spiritually, and then with the enslaved Africans. And I know that you mentioned it wasn't necessarily erased, but kind of removed in terms of their original names being stripped for them. Could you speak on to just some of those important aspects of names?
Sure. Well, names are not only important because they register a person as a member of a human community, but they're also these cosmic tattoos that essentially marks out an individual within a constellation of other individuals. In the case of African peoples especially, but not solely, it also registered them as being part of this constellation of ancestry. So think of ancestry as this large mass of just energy, right? Large mass of energy populated by people who have gone and come from this human experience and from this earth. And so it registers you as being a member of this mass, right? So at once, it makes you an individual, also makes you part of a collective. So you're both individuated, a person's both individuated and also communal at the same time. Only because, or primarily because, biologically speaking, human beings are not asexual organisms, right? We cannot beget ourselves. We have to come through someone else or someone else's. In the case of a sperm and an egg, and of course, all that is packaged into that DNA that at least forms the physiological portions of our body and our being. So names actually captures all that, but the names do more, especially among certain communities or certain African societies where names actually have more depth and more connection to ecology. So, for example, people are named based on the seasons or the natural cycles or the farming calendar or the circumstances of life, whether that may be drought or famine or a great harvest. You also have names that are meant to be ridiculing, to say that a child came but did not stay with the family. I mean, it left too early in their mind, either during infancy or during early adolescence. And so they'll give that child a name, whether that be a by name, a praise name, or a nickname, to indicate that this child, should not come back as that child, right? So in other words, if a child is ridiculed and they're called the one who brings, bad luck and destruction, then it means that the next cycle around, next go around for the energy that is that child, they should not come as that, right? And so these names are really crucial beyond simply just marking out you or I as an individual, because they do carry a package of not only ancestral information and data points, but it also conveys to them something peculiar and particular about that person as a member of this wide cultural, ecological, spiritual ecosystem.
No, definitely. And it goes to, I guess, and especially within the Caribbean community where people have what are called pet names, right? So they have other names that they are being called as well. So at the start of the slave trade, the Portuguese started the enslavement, and they had a different practice in terms when they would rename a lot of the enslaved Africans, and this mostly went to the Spanish Caribbean. Can you just speak a little bit on that one?
Sure. And so the Portuguese have the dubious distinction of being so-called the first, though they were not, because first implies the being the igniter or the initial step. But enslavement is an ongoing human project, right? The enslavement in ancient China that predates the Portuguese. In fact, it's something called Portugal. So the idea is that the Portuguese were in fact the plow that laid the path for other European seaborne empires in terms of connections to West Africa and then greater Africa in terms of the transport of captive African peoples that were launched into the Americas, into Europe, into the Mediterranean region, and of course, other parts of the world. So Portuguese, they fit within that circuit, right? So they're not really the first per se, but they fit within a circuit. In fact, just as a quick note to your audience, is that Arab Muslim merchants in North Africa and Northeast Africa were trafficking African peoples long before there was Portugal. In fact, what became Portugal was like this barren and sometimes almost irreverent outpost of the Roman Empire, right? Referred to as Lusitania, the sort of Latin or vulgar Latin outpost. It was really nothing to of any real remark. So it was unremarkable, and it remained that way. Portugal was this desolate, poor, and impoverished and small country on the southwestern portion of the Iberian Peninsula. Castile later became Spain, was really, the power in that region. So the Spaniards and these Arab Muslim merchants of Africa were trafficking Africans in Mediterranean, what is now Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, long before there was a Portugal. Just to put that into perspective, okay. Portuguese, what their claim is that they become the first seaborne European empire, right? Maritime empire that's able to use the sea to traffic, right? Trafficking captive bodies. So from that perspective, the Portuguese, therefore, they initiate, but also they innovate certain sorts of best practices that were followed by other European empire seekers, whether they be Spain, formerly Castile, whether they be the Dutch Netherlands, or they be the British England, or they be the Swedish or the Brandenburgers, which later became Germany. So all these will be empires follow the model set by the Portuguese, and the model was basically this in terms of naming, with some distinctions, of course. It's because the Portuguese were and the Spaniards were Catholic. Their naming practices, were shaped around Catholic dogma, which is a variant of Christian theology, Christian dogma, in a way that Portuguese saw themselves as defenders of the faith, meaning Catholic faith. And therefore, it was their duty not only to capture, but also to convert or baptize non-European, non-Iberian peoples in West Africa, African peoples, by raiding, by force, by negotiation, and sometimes by simply just trafficking, right? Yeah. And that began largely with, for example, North African, Arab Muslim, other traffickers in captive African bodies. So there's an outpost in Northwest Africa around between Morocco and Macedonia called Arjum, and that became sort of like this depot where horses were being traded for captive Africans, and horses, of course, were required by these savannah societies in West Africa, and so in North Africa too, beyond the desert. And so horses were one of the main commodities, and later on included foodstuff, included guns and firearms and so on. And so in that context, the namings became a function of the duty of these defenders of the faith, as it were, to essentially expand Christendom, right? Yeah. By force, by fraud, or any means. And so once captured, naming didn't start there. There was sort of like this very fake or false baptism where salt and water would be sprinkled on captive peoples. Now, in the 15th century, the numbers were small, meaning these are not large vessels yet. These are what are called caravels, right? And they hold maybe about 100 people, sometimes maybe 150. We didn't get to the Dutch and later vessels that hold 300, 400, 500, 600 captive people, right, across the Atlantic. And so the timing, again, context matters, right? Mm-hmm. And so in this context, those people would then be brought to either the Algarve or brought to the capital of Lisbon or Lisboa, the capital of Portugal. And they were either sold in the slave markets on the Tagus River in Lisbon, or sometimes they were repurposed or repackaged and sold in Castile or sold in Spain, in other of the major cities like Cordoba, Seville, and other parts. And some of these captives, once sold, then there would be the registration, right? That's when you get the notary. And then at that point, you would have the names that are assigned, right, at that moment. And the names would usually follow the name of the captive. Now, the Catholic factor here matters in, because here in Spanish and Portuguese name, you have you can have several names, right? For example, de Santos, meaning of Santos, right? Meaning your property of, you belong to, right? The family of Santos. And so, one would be, say, Maria dos Santos, right? Or Pedro dos Santos, right? And so, or for example, you have in the 15th century and 16th century, you have names based on complexion. You have Pedro Negro, right?
Yes.
Pedro Black, or Maria Moreno, right? Moreno is like a variant of Black, if you can imagine that. Or you may have Maria Preto, which is like a black, so like the shirt that I'm wearing. It's like the blackest of black.
Okay.
So, right. So the Portuguese and the Spaniards, under this Catholic, mantra and dogma, they saw at themselves to not only capture and exchange and sale, but also to convert and baptize and bring into Christendom. And so the names followed that pattern, whereas later on in the Dutch and British, they weren't really concerned about that per se. They were concerned about laboring and the like. And even when Protestant Christianity, right, and the British and Dutch experience came into play, those names followed a different pattern, right?
Yes.
The factor of religion here figures in a lot into the naming practices of these European empires and slavers.
Definitely it did, and definitely made an impression, to say the least. And so, with these enslaved Africans being stripped of their original name and the attempt to kind of have a "you are a nothing" mentality, would this have brought into more of their control, to further control them?
Them being the slavers?
And them being the enslaved.
Okay. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Now, I'll come to the heart of your question, but it's hard to tell, just to give your viewers and listeners some appreciation. It's hard to tell what really goes on in the inner corridors of a person's mind and inner being. It's like being in court, where it's hard to really measure and therefore convict intention, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there are ways to try to get close to it, but it's not an approximation. Likewise, hard to really say what truly went on in the inner corridors and being of the enslaved. It's really hard. The documents can't even scratch the surface of that, right? Yeah. Now, that being said, as a caveat, what we do know is that for the enslaved, there was often lip service paid to Catholic dogma, meaning the naming practices. And so, for example, on West Africa's Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, you would have people that were men that were brought to the Portuguese Inquisition to stand trial for crimes against the Catholic faith. And they may be registered under a Portuguese or Iberian name, but in the testimony and the witnesses, would you find that these people would actually be known by other names, other indigenous African names, right? Yeah. And we see some of this, for example, in one document that comes to mind, 1572, is a woman registered, under the Catholic framing of her personhood as Maria, but the priest who registered this and the people who of his kind who essentially would remind the person by calling them that name, noted in frustration and anger that this Maria was also known as Adjura, which means she was a Monday-born female on the Akan calendar, which opens up a whole story about who she was in terms of her personhood, right? In the villages. And so when she went to the villages that was adjacent to the Portuguese fortress or stronghold on the Gold Coast, or then called the Mina Coast, then, under that, in that arena of terror, right? Populated by almost all men, with weaponry, with tortures, with instruments of torture and violence. Under this regime of violence, she would answer to Maria. But the priest gives us insight into her personhood and into her inner being. Again, the document gives us some latitude to say that when she was in the villages, they're known by other names, which means they're called other names, which means they're using other languages, non-Portuguese languages, which means people have their own self-understanding, even if they're known by another name. And this is true, as you mentioned, about nicknames. For example, today, people of African ancestry, here in New York City, or you're there in Canada, you find persons who are large in size and stature, and their nickname is Tiny. You say that's third, right? But it makes sense. It's sort of like a cosmic joke, And so there are different kinds of naming. So on the streets, he's called Tiny, but to his mother, he's James Robinson.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Or he could be Kwasi Konadu, right? And so names, again, they can be a trap, because in the records, when we see them, we say, aha, that person is Betsy, or it's Jupiter, right?
Yes.
And that's how they're registered. But we can't give the slavers and their regime, the bureaucratic regime of violence, authority over the personhood of that person without knowing something about their personhood. Because in the so-called slave quarters, that person will be known by something else, right? And so that's what I mean by how we read the documents and how we read personhood and identity, and therefore names, is definitely crucial to understanding something about how names continued, how they morphed, if any, and how they were used on different layers in terms of how people could negotiated their lives in these colonial societies that were based on the instrument of pure terror.
Very true, very true. So we're going to now just go through some of the namings on some of the documents here, and starting first and foremostly on the baptism, where an enslaved person would now go from their known name, which was usually just one name, to now having what's called a proper name. So on the screen that I have here is just from in Jamaica, so Saint Anne in Orange Park. And we'll just go through some of the list as to what their African name was known as, and then their baptized name, and what possibly could have been, I guess, a reasoning or a meaning behind that.
So on the screen you have in front of us, there are a number of names there. And of course, the first thing that jumps out is the first and last name, right? And here the last name or the surname registers one as a property. In Jamaica, as in places like Virginia, here in the United States, colonial law was pretty much, at least English-speaking colonial law, which is based on Old Roman law, which is the base of English common law, were pretty much the same. And so if we talk about Jamaica, we can talk about Virginia as British colonial societies or English-speaking colonial societies. And so the last surname registered one, and this here is a part of the template provided by the Portuguese, because here is the same function of the Santos. It registered one a property of, right?
Yes.
And some of these names were based on guilds, like Wright or blacksmith and so on. And so these names meant that a person, would be named, let's say, Bennett, or Porter, or another name, or Wright, as you see down below.
Yes.
In the document, Williams, right? It means that they are the property of Mr. or Mrs. Wright. And so the last name, though it conferred a second name, it didn't, in fact, emancipate them. In fact, to me, it re-enslaved them, because it made them a property of their owner. And so as long as the person wears, that name and responds to it and uses it, they are re-inscribing or reaffirming the fact that they are the property of, right?
Yes.
That's the first observation. But then the other observation here are the names. For example, at the very top, you see there a coffee,
yes,
right? Which in phonetic English is spelled C-U, in most cases, spelled C-U-F-F-E, C-U-F-E-E. And that coffee refers to the Akan name, Kofi.
Yeah.
but also Kwafi. It means the same thing.
Okay.
I can explain later why the ko and the ka and kwa may be switched up, but it has the same meaning.
Okay.
So Kofi was a name for a male child born on Friday, right? As in the, past Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. And his name, by the way, means Kofi the fourth, meaning he was the fourth born child.
Okay.
His fourth. So again, name gives you birth order, right? It means he has siblings.
Okay.
which means if he's the fourth, it means that there may be a fifth. And so again, the name is a package that opens up, its own history on itself. And so you see that there. And there are other names there, but the Kofi again stands out as one that registers one as being from a particular group of people that can be traced to a particular genealogy in a particular, again, place, and also intellectual history that goes with that individual, just by the name alone, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure if there's anything else you want me to peel out of this, but
No, I think that was pretty much it on that particular case. And then on the second one, which is just from the slave registers itself. Let me know if you can see that.
yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Perfect.
All right. Yes, and so in this quote unquote enslaved register, and I'm sure definitely scholars will know this, and graduate students will know what this is about. For those that are unaware, these are, and again, this is from Jamaica, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so these were submitted as part of inventory for taxation purposes, right? Because the enslaved were counted among property as chattel. And so this was not simply for ethnographic reasons. It was largely for taxation purposes and bureaucracy. But it also provided an inventory for the enslaved. Now, for those who are trying to read out, some of the stories of the people that are etched in these registers, some of the fascinating parts here are not the names alone, but the categories here for color,
yes,
complexion, for age, and there's an interesting category for African or Creole, which we can talk about because that's part of the name process. And then there are all these remarks about the person that are being, essentially codified in these documents. And then you have essentially, if there's any increase or cause thereof for the individuals, meaning, for example, there's a birth is registered, meaning increase, right?
That's right.
Obviously, it's a decrease. And then finally, there's a decrease there again, and the cause of it. So for the genealogists, those who are curious, and definitely for people who are history buff, these are our limited but very important sources for digging into family, but also broadly speaking, African diasporic histories in the Americas, Jamaica no less. Now, there are names here, and these are male names that are there, and they're singular names, right?
That's right.
And so, for example, you have a James, right? You have a Richford, but you also have a Tom Taylor, right? And those are usually people who are usually people that are the offspring of African and white or European African women and white European males, or African Black women and European males, but not always, but usually the case. And so they'll have a surname, and then you see there are Creoles, which is not a cultural designation. That's more so a location designation, meaning they're born on the island.
Yeah.
And now in the scholarly literature, for those who are interested, there's a lot of discussion about Creole, which has its own set of issues. But I want to make clear to listening and viewing that it's more of a location or nationality category than it is a cultural or ethnographic descriptor. But then if you move further down, you pass maybe about, I count here about 12 Creole, then you have these African notations, right? Meaning they were born somewhere on the African continents. And these people too are named with their aliases. A few have aliases that are there. And for the most part here, these particular names, they are English names. I'm looking further to see if there's any, I think
Now,
down,
would
yeah.
some of these further alias names, would that, give an indication that they were then baptized? They went from their singular name to now a formal name, so to speak?
Well, the aliases, and this is, I'm glad you asked the question. I was going to get to it.
Mm-hmm.
These aliases, whether it's Ellison or here it is John Palmer,
Mm-hmm.
or Stuart Dixon,
Yeah.
or Henry, I think is Dorman.
Yeah.
Yeah, these aliases were created cleverly by the enslaved, meaning they would pick other English speaking names to evade surveillance and detection.
Okay.
In other words, if a person is looking for let's say Thansby or Thornby, and the alias was Bob Dixon, right?
Mm-hmm.
It will be confusing if the seeker only knows the person by one name, right? And so
Yeah.
these are clever ways which the enslaved would actually try to perplex the regime of slavery by essentially creating aliases, right? And sometimes a person would have 3 or 4 aliases. I've seen documents with that. They're also
Okay.
in the runaway slave advertisements, right? Whether it's Jamaica Gleaner, Gazette, my apologies, not the Gleaner, it's more contemporary. But the Gazette, or Kingston Gazette, they'll have these runaway slave advertisement that would indicate that the person also known as this and this and this.
Okay.
The aliases were meant to evade capture, meant to evade or inhibit precise location, right? And so by registering it on the slave register, it was essentially meant to alert the authorities that, hey, this person also known as this, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, which is very clever on the part of the enslaved, meaning they would use the interpolated or the imposed names upon them in ways that would try to essentially evade surveillance and detection by using the names that were thrown upon them against the slaveholders.
Very interesting times when I see these records and go through all these documents. It's just quite interesting. And we'll go to the last one here, which is the table of the different names based on, as you mentioned before earlier in the discussion, days of the week, both male and female.
Indeed, and these are stubbornly Akan names. Now they're not day names, though they are part of or registered the day in which a person is born. Time is also considered. So, for example,
Okay.
my name is Kwasi,
Mm-hmm.
meaning I'm a male child born on Sunday, as you see there on the top row. But I was born in the evening, and so there's a different temperament and different gauging of the kind of Kwasi that I am, opposed to Kwasi born in the morning. So
Okay.
the timing of the day matters. More importantly, these are referred to as krading, meaning soul names, because the idea is that my soul as Kwasi, and if for you, what day were you born on?
Tuesday.
Okay, so you would be Abena, and so it means my soul came to this earth for human experience on a Sunday. Your soul came to this earth for human experience on a Tuesday. That is packaging the name. So they're not day names. They're actually soul names called Krading,
Okay.
meaning soul, and Ding meaning name, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these Krading, they register one as essentially your soul coming to the earth, coming from where one might imagine, coming from the other world of spiritual forces and figures, because we as human beings are simply spiritual beings packaged in a human, frame, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as such, the soul name is one that stays with the person even after they meet their human demise. In libation or other rituals of remembrances, they are still remembered as Kwasi Konadu or as Abena. I'll make a name up. Abena.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, or better name, Abena Sapong. They're registered at that. So when they call your name and they remember you, the name still stays, right? In other words, the name has an afterlife, right?
Yes.
Lives on in memory and is invoked and invited through ritual libation, other kinds of rituals of remembrances. And that's very important here. That's why they're not day names, right? In other words, the day changes, the name still stays. When a person passes on, the name still stays.
Yes.
And so these are really indexes for personhood connected to a broad ancestry and a broad field of ecology, of culture, of ethnographic data, packaged into these small kernels. And I can tell you much more about each one.
Okay, yeah.
Expand the package.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Pick a name then.
How about, again, because it was mentioned on the slave record, Kofi.
Okay, Kofi. So Kofi, as you see there, as you view there, is a Friday born. And the complement there would be a fia or sometimes a four, depending upon your location in what is now Ghana, West Africa. Those on the coast would use a four. Sometimes they may use amba. Those in the further north may use a four, and those in the forest central area use a fia.
Okay.
Yes, the location matters. So, for example, my proper name is if you're deep in the forest is Akwesi, is an A in front of the K, right? Akwesi. But in other areas it just be Kwesi, and on the coast it's Kwesi spelled with an E rather than an A, so it's Kwesi.
Okay.
So there's slight phonetic nuances depending on location, right? Again, the name will specify that. So if you see Kofi, let's say or let's say I'll use another one. Let's say you see Kojo, Kojo. That's for the coast. Normally, the person's from the coastal area. But if you see Kwajo, which is Kwado, Kwajo, if you see Kwajo, he's in the forest, right? He's from the forest interior. So the sound and the spellings of the names also, again, refer kind of boomerang back to a particular, not precise, but general, ecology and location, and therefore groups of people, cultural groups of people in those areas. Again, these names are kernels that have these matrices, that have lots of data packaged into them. So example with Kofi, he's born on Friday, but on the Akan calendar of 42 days, there are 6 Fridays. The question is which Friday, right?
Yeah.
If I knew if I knew, or make a birthday up, right? Let's say a person born on September 5th, let's say 1825, right? Or in this case, 1825. Then that will give us also some precise data about which Friday he was born on. What taboos does he have as a Friday born person, both male and female? What greetings between me as Kofi and you, Efia, another Friday born person?
Yeah.
What animals we should never harm? What animals we should protect? You can see where I'm going. There's a lot of data packaged into the name that I can tell you about just based on the name alone.
Yeah, because these names do appear a number of times. Like when you're looking at these records, especially Kofi, especially Kujo, you see these all the time and they have to mean something. And going through what you're saying in terms of what the analogy of all of these names and all of the intricacies that are a part of it then gives a much more broader perspective. And for someone looking at these records and trying to understand and researching, this definitely helps.
It does, but I would say this is a caveat that important note, not a caveat that behind the names is also a language, right?
Yes.
And so to interpret these names, there are 2 important prerequisites: is both cultural background, that is the cultural background of these individuals, because they carry it in their names, to be able to interpret them, I think get the most out of them, and then of course the language in which they're coded, right? So both language and names are crucial to understanding who these people are.
No, definitely. And so with the language, I know you mentioned about the language, but would that then be, I guess, what is spoken? And again, using this to find out, I guess, the background of the individual as well, because that's another challenge that is seen for most to be able to get to that first African ancestor at most times. So let's say they do find where that person is from, and let's say it is from the region of Ghana. How would they then be able to determine which language is that really from?
This is clear because the language is a Akan tree.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and again,
Perfect.
names, again, they reference a particular African language, in which in other words, the coding, right? So they're coded in a particular African language. And that's stubbornly, absolutely clear from even with the English phonetic rendering, because remember, the enslaved were not recording their own names.
That's right.
So it's based on the ear, right, of whatever notary or bureaucrat recorded these names.
Well, it's definitely another layer to kind of look at all these things and to be able to really, because I know for myself, looking at these records and trying to understand and to put a context to things, it definitely does make it a challenge to kind of figure out, well, what does this mean? Because it has to mean something. Especially growing up Jamaican, you definitely notice that a lot of things mean different things depending on what the context is, right? So it's just trying to understand that. So I wanted to thank you for that, but as well, just something else for people that are researching during this time. What else do they need to take into consideration, especially when looking at names?
Well, the two prerequisites that I mentioned, we need not have fear to learn an African language. I don't mean necessarily fluency, but at least to break the conceptual barrier that these languages are impossible to learn, which they're not. If we can learn Spanish, we can learn African language.
Yes.
All languages have rules called grammar that determines which goes where and why. In terms of word formation and placement, and all languages, of course, have sounds, phonetic value, right? So sounds and rules, and you work your way through. The language is really the gateway, right?
Yes.
And I don't mean just pronunciation. I mean, the names, are encoded in a language, and that language will open up. So, for example, the data I share with you, about greetings and taboos and the kinds of ritual obligations for Friday born, in the case of Kofi, or for you, Tuesday born individuals, where to go, what river, what stream, what to do, which animals not to arm, which animals you can, consume, what to do on a day of birth every 42 days, right? Wearing white, abstaining from intercourse and meats and other favorite foods, meditating. All the things are really baked into the language, right?
Yeah.
And so for the researcher, particularly of Akan Diasporic history, there's been sort of a phobia and even taboo to learn an African language. But people in the Caribbean, because their starting point is usually, whatever blockade set up by white terrorism and violence, that somehow an African language is impossible acquisition on their tongue. They already have it. So for example, so in Jamaica there's a place in the records office called Park, right? And so the is the name of the language, Akan. It's already there. Right. So and all the words that we have in Jamaican nation language, right? Janko, Su, and so on. Right? These are tree words, right? Doti, right? They're referring to the earth or the ground, right? So I'm saying the sounds are there, right? The grammar are there. For example, in Jamaican, they say, take yourself and bring yourself, right? In tree, and so you have to first take yourself somewhere to go somewhere. In other words, my body won't leave myself to go to the store. I have to take myself to the store, right?
Exactly.
So the way that we think, we meaning in the African diaspora, think is already programmed, in some part of our cellular memory, in our DNA. But the inhibitor is the idea that, somehow African language is beyond apprehension. And it isn't, because it's actually baked into the languages we speak already. So whether it's so-called Black English or Ebonics, or it's Jamaican Nation language or Haitian Creole, the grammar is baked in there, right? Just look at how we structure words and sentences and how those words dance in a certain rhythm. So I'm just saying we have much more building blocks there than people want to imagine or think or believe.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I definitely had my lessons given to my mother about the breakdown of patois. So yes. So it's definitely there already, and we just have to be able to recognize it and see it for what it is and embrace it. So for that, I just want to thank you so much, Kwasi, for coming on to the podcast and speaking on this, because I really do appreciate it and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.